The aircraft cruised steadily through the skies. The seatbelt sign had been switched off, and passengers were quietly settling in for the journey. Everyone, that is, except for one woman whose day was about to take a shocking turn. Her only fault? The way she looked. No one knew her story, and no one suspected what was about to unfold. But by the end of this flight, she'd leave a lasting impression, one they would never forget. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories. It was a typical Tuesday morning when Elena Dawson boarded her flight from Halston to Westport. She wore a simple pair of jeans and a well-loved cardigan, nothing extravagant, just comfortable and practical. Slung over her shoulder was a soft-aged leather bag, and in her hand a paperback novel she'd been meaning to finish for weeks. As she made her way through the narrow plain aisle, a few eyes glanced her way, but quickly returned to their own concerns. She offered a polite smile as she reached her seat, gently tucking her bag into the overhead bin. The woman seated next to her barely looked up before returning to her phone. Elena settled in with a soft sigh. This trip was just one leg of a busy week ahead, one she hoped to get through with as little friction as possible. She wasn't interested in chatting. Instead, she pulled out a small notebook and began jotting down ideas for the project she was managing at work. Her mind slipped easily into focus, the dull hum of the engines fading behind her thoughts. Just then, a flight attendant, Morgan Tate, strolled down the aisle with brisk, practiced steps. Her uniform was crisp, her expression composed. She paused ever so slightly as she noticed Elena, her gaze sweeping over the woman's plain clothes with a flicker of quiet judgment. It was barely visible, but enough for Elena to catch. Still, Elena paid no mind and returned to her notes. A few minutes later, Morgan came back, her demeanor noticeably colder this time. Her posture was more rigid, her tone clipped. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said politely but firmly. "May I see your boarding pass?" Elena looked up, mildly surprised but cooperative. She handed over the pass without hesitation. Morgan examined it, her eyebrows lifting slightly. "This says first class," she said sharply, disbelief creeping into her voice. "That's right," Elena replied evenly. There was a brief silence as Morgan stared at her. Her lips tightened, and her brows drew together in a skeptical frown. She glanced around as though searching for someone to validate what she was seeing. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her tone stiff. "There appears to be a mistake. This can't be right." Elena tilted her head, confusion settling in. "I booked this flight well in advance. My seat is confirmed." "I'll need you to move," Morgan said flatly, crossing her arms. "There are seats available in the main cabin. I believe you'll be more comfortable there." Stunned, Elena blinked, trying to understand the sudden shift. Around her, passengers remained disengaged, eyes glued to their screens or conversations. She felt her pulse quicken, her thoughts racing. Why was this happening? And why did it feel so wrong? The tone in Morgan Tate's voice sent a chill through Elena. "I don't understand," Elena said softly, struggling to keep her voice steady. "My ticket is valid. Why are you asking me to move?" Morgan's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't up for discussion. Either you change seats now, or I'll be forced to call security." The words hit like a slap. Elena leaned back slowly, gripping the strap of her bag a little tighter. Her heart pounded but she didn't let it show. She had been in uncomfortable situations before. She knew when to hold her ground and when to let the moment pass. Without a word, she nodded, her movements calm and deliberate as she gathered her belongings. A few passengers looked up now, their whispers low but noticeable, eyes flicking between Elena and Morgan. She could feel their stares crawl across her as she stepped into the aisle. Still, she kept her posture upright, refusing to let shame settle on her shoulders. Morgan escorted her to the economy section, gesturing to a cramped middle seat in a crowded row. Elena placed her bag beneath the seat and quietly sat down, her face unreadable. The downgrade was instant, the space tighter, the atmosphere different. Around her, other passengers barely glanced her way. A man nearby flipped through a magazine. Someone else was dozing with headphones on. No one seemed to care. She wasn't angry, not exactly, just confused. Why had this happened? Why her? She tried to adjust herself in the narrow seat, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the strange interaction. The look in Morgan's eyes hadn't been one of concern. It had been dismissal, a quiet message that said, "You don't belong here." She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and typed quickly. Got bumped to the back. I'll explain later. As she hit send, a small smile curled at the corners of her lips, one filled with quiet certainty. This wasn't the end of the story, far from it. Leaning her head against the window, she gazed out at the clouds drifting below. The steady drone of the engines filled the cabin like a lullaby, but it couldn't drown out her thoughts. She wasn't upset. She wasn't embarrassed. She was focused. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. And Elena Dawson had no intention of letting it go unanswered. She glanced around the cabin. Most passengers were busy with their own worlds, heads down, ears plugged in, but there was a tension in the air, a quiet discomfort that lingered like a shadow. Some had noticed the way Morgan had walked her down the aisle. Some had whispered. Some had looked away. But no one had seen her. Not really. She picked up her phone again and sent a second message. This one shorter, but far more pointed. They moved me. I'll need your help when we land. She hit send. No hesitation. Her husband, Daniel Dawson, was a strategist by nature. Calm, powerful, and not one to get involved unless absolutely necessary. But something told her he'd take this personally. As she tucked the phone back into her bag, Elena sat a little straighter, her calmness slowly crystallizing into resolve. She wasn't just going to sit back and let this go. Not this time. There was something about this moment that felt different. Elena didn't know why, but deep in her gut, she knew this time didn't end the way others had. Sliding her phone back into her bag, she looked up just as a few flight attendants passed through the aisle. Their expressions were unreadable, carefully neutral, trained. Morgan Tate stood near the front of the plane again, talking to another crew member, but Elena's gaze lingered on her a moment longer. She could feel it, the tension. Morgan was rattled. She may have been trying to play it cool, but she wouldn't come anywhere near Elena now, not after what had happened. Elena leaned her head back, her mind returning to that moment earlier when Morgan had looked at her like she was in the wrong place. That wasn't new. People had underestimated her before, judged her without knowing the first thing about her. But this was the first time someone had done it so boldly, so openly, right to her face, and in front of strangers. It had been quick, it had been cold, and Elena wasn't going to let it go unchecked. She didn't need to raise her voice or cause a scene. That wasn't her way. She had other means, quieter, more effective ways of making things right. The plane hummed along in a steady motion, but Elena's thoughts moved faster. Her fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, not out of nerves, but patience. She was waiting, watching, and with every passing minute, she felt her sense of control grow. In contrast, Morgan was unraveling. Little by little, she kept glancing toward the back, toward Elena's seat. Her movements weren't as smooth as they had been earlier. Her posture, once perfect, was now tight and unsure. She knew she'd made a mistake. She just didn't know who she had made it against. It was too late for second guesses. The moment had passed, and now it was time for the consequences to begin taking shape. Elena kept her composure, her gaze soft as it drifted out the window. Outside, the clouds stretched for miles, white and unbothered. Then the intercom crackled overhead, and the captain's voice came through, calm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you're enjoying your flight. If there's anything we can assist you with, please don't hesitate to let one of our crew members know. Standard, routine." But to Elena, the words felt distant, irrelevant. She glanced at her watch, still mid-flight, but the time was drawing closer. Her fingers hovered over her phone again. This time, the message she typed was longer, more deliberate. "Will need to be discreet. When I land, I'll need a quick move. Be ready. This has to be handled right." She sent it, then leaned back in her seat again, eyes fixed on the drifting horizon. The plane was already in motion, and there was no turning back. Just then, Morgan passed by again. This time, she didn't even glance in Elena's direction. Her shoulders were tense, her steps hurried. She looked straight ahead, as if pretending Elena didn't exist might undo what had already been done. But it wouldn't. Elena watched her go with a subtle flicker of satisfaction. Morgan knew something was coming. She just didn't know how far it would reach. A few rows up, the flight attendants were moving through first class, handing out drinks and snacks. Morgan had resumed her duties there, back where Elena should have been sitting all along. But something about her seemed off. The energy around her had shifted. There was a stillness in the air, a thick layer of tension that clung to everything like the static before a storm. And Elena? She wasn't angry, she wasn't scared, she was ready. There wasn't a shred of doubt in Elena Dawson's mind this would play out exactly as it needed to. What mattered now wasn't what had happened, but what would happen next. The power was shifting, and she intended to hold it when the wheels hit the ground in Westport. The rest of the flight dragged by, each minute stretched thin by anticipation. Still, Elena stayed composed. She kept writing in her notebook, each stroke of her pen calm and deliberate, as if nothing had happened at all. The pages filled with notes, reminders, strategy. Her mind never straying from the bigger picture. From time to time, she'd glance up toward the front of the cabin. Morgan Tate was there, carrying out her duties with robotic efficiency, but Elena could see it. The subtle falter in her steps, the stiffness in her shoulders. Her mask was slipping, and that flicker of doubt in her eyes told Elena everything she needed to know. Morgan wasn't nearly as sure of herself as she'd been at the start of the flight, and Elena? She knew this wasn't over, far from it. She had the ability to change the tide, and she was simply waiting for the perfect moment to do so. In the back of her mind, she could already see it. The final scene, the moment of realization when Morgan would understand just who she had tried to dismiss. But for now, Elena remained still, letting the hours glide by with the same quiet grace as the aircraft itself. She wasn't confrontational by nature, but this wasn't ordinary, this was personal. Morgan hadn't just questioned her ticket, she had questioned her worth. And Elena was done letting that slide. This wasn't about revenge, it was about respect. Her eyes drifted to the clouds outside her window. The sky was wide and open, but inside her, focus narrowed into a single determined line. She pulled out her phone again, not to text this time, but to make a call. Her voice was low, her words precise. Watch for my signal. It's almost time. Be ready the moment we land. She ended the call quickly and tucked the phone away. The plan was alive now, no more theory. It was set in motion, and every second brought it closer to the point of no return. Up in the first-class cabin, Morgan continued moving through her tasks, but her rhythm had changed. Elena noticed it, the slight missteps, the nervous glances backward. Morgan kept looking her way, like her conscience wouldn't let her forget. And she shouldn't. As Morgan passed again, their eyes met for just a breath of a moment. A flicker, a silent charge. Morgan gave her a tight, rehearsed smile. It didn't land. Elena held her gaze for a moment longer, silent but steady. She didn't need to speak. The look alone said, "You know you were wrong." Morgan quickly turned and walked away, pretending everything was fine, but her stiff posture betrayed her. She didn't want another confrontation, not now. And Elena, she remained serene. That unwavering calm of hers began to draw the attention of other passengers too. The few who had noticed the earlier incident now watched her differently, more curious, more aware. There were hushed exchanges and glances passed between rows, but Elena welcomed the attention. She was no longer just a woman in economy class. She was the storm beneath the surface. As the plane began its gentle descent into Westport, the change in energy was impossible to ignore. It was coming. Elena checked her watch. Almost there. She inhaled deeply, then glanced up once more. Morgan was walking the aisle, her face blank, her steps too quick, but her eyes kept drifting back, like she could feel the weight of her mistake tightening around her with every mile. And soon, she'd learn just how big that mistake had been. Morgan Tate moved down the aisle, her hands busy, her face composed, or at least trying to be. But Elena Dawson could see through the act. Every so often, Morgan's eyes flicked back toward her, quick glances laced with unease. She was starting to feel it, the consequences of her actions pressing down on her like the cabin pressure mid-descent. Elena noticed, but didn't react. Instead, a subtle smile touched her lips. Morgan still had no idea just how deep the situation ran, but she would. Soon, the entire crew would understand exactly who they had misjudged. This wasn't about one woman being wronged on a plane. This was about the system, and Elena had every intention of holding it accountable. The plane began to descend, the mild turbulence rocking it gently as the crew prepared for landing. Around her, passengers adjusted their seats and stowed away belongings. Elena's heart beat calmly. No rush, no nerves. She had caused no disruption. She had followed every rule. But what had happened wouldn't be forgotten, and it certainly wouldn't be forgiven. The aircraft touched down in Westport. tires meeting the runway with a smooth kiss. A low wave of chatter rolled through the cabin as seatbelts unclicked and travelers stretched their legs. The usual post-landing buzz was settling in. Flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles. But Morgan, she wasn't focused. Her gaze kept drifting, searching for the woman seated near the back, the one she had tried to ignore. Elena remained seated, her posture composed, her energy grounded. Around her, passengers stood, reaching overhead and inching toward the exit, but she simply waited, watching the moment unfold with a quiet clarity. She knew Morgan would try to avoid her, but the time for avoidance had passed. Elena Dawson didn't go looking for conflict, but when injustice found her, she didn't let it slip by. And now, both the airline and Morgan Tate would have to face what they set in motion. As the plane taxied toward the gate, her phone buzzed quietly inside her bag. She pulled it out and checked the screen. One short message from Daniel. "Ready when you are. Make it count." She smiled just a little. It was time. This wasn't just about a judgment call anymore. This was about making things right. Standing with unhurried grace, Elena reached for her bag and slung it over her shoulder. She took one last look down the aisle. Morgan was heading toward the front of the plane, her face stiff, her shoulders tense. As she passed, Elena looked directly at her, and this time Morgan looked back. Just for a second, her lips tightened, her gaze wavered, and then she looked away. She couldn't face her, not really, but Elena didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She wasn't going to cause a scene. She wasn't here to embarrass Morgan in front of passengers or crew. No, she had something far more impactful in mind. The line of passengers slowly filed out. Still, Elena waited. She wasn't in a hurry. This wasn't about exiting a plane. It was about owning the moment. When the aisle cleared, she finally stepped forward, walking toward the front with deliberate ease. She felt Morgan's eyes on her the entire time, even before she reached the door. There she stood, Morgan Tate, offering her robotic smile and forced politeness as she spoke to each disembarking passenger. "Thank you for flying with us today," she said, her voice stiff with practiced formality. But as Elena approached, something in Morgan's expression shifted. That smile wavered. Her eyes couldn't quite meet hers. "Thank you, Morgan," Elena said gently. Her tone was light, but there was a quiet power behind it. She offered a soft smile. But it wasn't the kind that forgave. It was the kind that said, "I remember." The smile Elena Dawson had given Morgan Tate wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either. It simply said, "I know exactly what you did, and I'm not angry, not yet." As Elena stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she felt the subtle stir of eyes on her. Some passengers who had witnessed parts of the earlier exchange now followed her with quiet curiosity. They didn't know the whole story, but they sensed there was more to it than a misplaced seat. Something deeper had happened, something they could feel in the air. But Elena didn't acknowledge the glances. She didn't need to. Her silence, her poise, that was her power now. She made her way through the gate area, her pace measured, her posture unshaken. She wasn't nervous. If anything, she felt steadier now than she had the entire flight. That calm had become her armor. Morgan, on the other hand, was unraveling. Maybe she didn't know it yet, but her control was slipping, and Elena could see the cracks forming. As she walked through the bright corridors of the Westport Airport, Elena drew in a long, controlled breath. She was ready. The next step was already waiting for her. Just before she reached baggage claim, her phone buzzed. She glanced down. A new message from Daniel. They're on their way. Make sure she sees it. A faint smile touched her lips. The moment had come. Everything was in motion now. And soon Morgan Tate, along with the airline, would understand just who they had tried to dismiss. Elena continued down the terminal, each step more intentional than the last. It felt like the entire atmosphere was shifting with her. The injustice of what happened had sparked something far larger than a personal insult. And now she was about to flip the script. No need to rush. The game had already started, and Elena was holding all the pieces. At the baggage carousel, the low mechanical hum of the belts echoed softly in the background, but Elena didn't reach for her luggage just yet. She simply stood still, scanning the flow of people around her, waiting. And then, there he was. A tall, sharply dressed man stepped through the glass doors, his movements calm but unmistakably purposeful. His presence was hard to miss, not just because of the tailored suit or his confident stride, but because of the sleek midnight black Rolls Royce parked just beyond the terminal glass, gleaming beneath the airport lights. Daniel Dawson. She offered him a small, knowing smile as he approached. He reached her side and rested a hand gently on her shoulder, a simple, grounding gesture that said, "I'm here. I've got your back. Everything go according to plan?" he asked, voice low but steady. Elena nodded. "It's all in place, just waiting for the final cue." He gave a slight smile in return. He had seen her navigate difficult situations before. Cool, calculated, always 10 steps ahead. But even he could feel the weight behind this one. This wasn't just about a rude flight attendant or an uncomfortable incident. This was about dignity, power, and perception. It was about sending a message that couldn't be ignored. They stood quietly for a moment, watching as the first pieces of luggage began sliding onto the conveyor. The hum of the machine mixed with the murmur of passengers around them. But Daniel barely noticed. He was watching Elena, as he always did, with admiration and quiet respect. He knew what most people didn't. Elena wasn't someone you underestimated, and when she was disrespected, she didn't retaliate. She recalibrated. As the final passengers trickled out of the gate area, Morgan Tate appeared at the terminal entrance. She was trying to hold herself together, but it was obvious she was struggling. The tightness in her jaw, the way her eyes kept scanning the room. She wasn't looking for luggage. She was looking for Elena, and she found her. In the middle of the crowd, Morgan Tate's eyes swept the terminal until they landed on Elena Dawson, and for a split second, she froze. Their eyes met, and Elena watched the realization slowly unfold on Morgan's face. Her expression shifted, color draining, posture stiffening. She knew now. Morgan had no idea earlier who she was dealing with. She hadn't understood the kind of woman she tried to brush aside. But in that moment, something clicked, and Elena could feel it. The shift in power, swift and irreversible. She didn't hold the moment too long. She simply turned to Daniel, gave him a nod, and together they began walking toward the exit. Her phone buzzed again. A new message. "We've received your complaint. Expect follow-up shortly." It was from the airline's corporate office. Elena didn't bother replying. She didn't need to. The first domino had already fallen, and what was coming next would make it clear. They had picked the wrong person to underestimate. What Morgan did wasn't just an isolated error, It was the symptom of something far more embedded, a culture, a system. And Elna wasn't about to let that pass unnoticed. She stepped outside into the warm Westport air, the sun painting long lines across the pavement. Her mind was already ahead, mapping the next moves, seeing 10 steps into the future. Beside her, Daniel walked in silence. They didn't need to speak. The Rolls Royce idled nearby, sleek and steady, its polished black surface reflecting the sharp lines of the city beyond. They slid into the back seat, and as the soft hum of the engine came to life, the car glided away from the curb, carrying them forward, away from the airport, but deeper into the heart of what was coming. Elena leaned back against the leather interior, her gaze on the window, watching the skyline unfold. She was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence that came from uncertainty. It was the kind that settled in when things were falling into place. This hadn't just been about a seat. It had been about perception, about assumption, about the way people were measured by surface impressions. No one had taken the time to really see her, and now she was in the position to make sure that kind of lazy judgment was addressed head-on. The car was quiet except for the smooth hum beneath them. Daniel occasionally glanced at her, his face unreadable, but he didn't say a word. He knew her too well to interrupt. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was steady, quiet, but razor-sharp. "They'll be hearing from me soon," she said, "and they'll learn what happens when they decide someone doesn't belong based on how they look." A pause, then she added, "As for Morgan, she has no idea what she stepped into." Daniel nodded, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. "You did what needed to be done," he said calmly, "but you know this won't be the end of it. They're not just going to take this quietly." "I'm counting on that," Elena replied, a small smile touching her lips. Her eyes stayed on the window, watching the city roll past. This isn't about filing a complaint. It's about forcing them to face the truth. She let her words settle in the air between them, heavy, purposeful. "This wasn't just Morgan's failure," she continued. "It's a reflection of the environment the airline operates in, a place where bias hides behind uniforms and fake smiles." She knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't personal revenge. This was exposure, and the ripple effect, it was just beginning. As the car weaved through the energetic streets of Westport, Elena Dawson's phone buzzed again. She glanced down, expecting another message from the airline's corporate office. But it wasn't a message. It was a call. The number was unfamiliar, but she didn't hesitate. "Elena Dawson," she answered, her tone calm and direct. The voice on the other end was clipped and professional, with a subtle urgency threaded beneath it. "Ms. Dawson, this is Samantha Greer from the airline's executive team. We've received your formal complaint and we'd like to speak with you further. Please remain available. We'd like to schedule a meeting as soon as you're settled." A slow, knowing smile touched Elena's lips. "Of course," she replied coolly. "I'll be expecting your call." She ended the conversation without another word, slipping her phone back into her bag. Her heart beat just a little faster, but it wasn't nerves. It was the sharp, electric thrill of momentum. She had been waiting for this moment. They were taking her seriously now. And Morgan Tate, she was just the beginning. The real weight of responsibility belonged to the company that allowed behavior like that to go unchecked. This wasn't going to be forgotten, not for her, and not for anyone else who had ever been pushed aside and made to feel small. As the Rolls Royce approached their destination, Elena was already a few steps ahead, her mind shifting into strategy. Every move had been carefully considered, and now it was time to ensure that the change she'd set into motion stuck. This wasn't about payback, it was about principle. It was about forcing people in positions of power to finally see what happens when they stop paying attention to the people they think don't matter. The car pulled up in front of a luxury hotel, modern and pristine. Elena stepped out, the sound of her heels echoing against the polished stone entrance. Around her, the vibrant pulse of Westport carried on, but Elena moved with calm, deliberate grace, completely in control. Daniel Dawson followed quietly behind, a steady presence by her side. He didn't speak, but he didn't have to. His gaze said everything. He believed in her plan. He trusted her vision. Check-in was a swift. Polished staff, friendly smiles, no wasted time. Despite the whirlwind of the day, Elena was composed, collected. She lived in a world of pressure and high expectations, and it showed. But this moment felt heavier. More important, this wasn't just another business trip. It was personal, and it was purposeful. Once inside their suite, Elena paused in front of the expansive window, looking out across the Westport skyline. The view was breathtaking, but her focus wasn't on the beauty. It was on what came next. She ran her fingers through her hair, steadying herself. There was no room for distraction now, no room for doubt. She hadn't come this far to be silenced by a smile and a scripted apology. This wasn't about her alone. This was about the people like her, the ones who'd been dismissed, misjudged, or quietly shuffled out of the way simply because they didn't look the part. This was for every time someone had made a snap decision based on nothing but surface. Daniel stepped onto the balcony, giving her a moment of a space. He knew how she worked, knew how she needed silence to plan her next move. This wasn't going to end with a statement or a meeting. This was the beginning of something much larger. At the desk, her laptop waited. She opened it and skimmed through a few emails, her mind already filtering the noise for what mattered. And there it was, an email from the airline's executive office. They wanted a meeting, as she expected, but Elena wasn't here to play polite. She wasn't going to let them bury this. With a smooth conversation and a handshake, they had awakened something much bigger than a complaint. This was going to be a reckoning, and she wasn't just speaking for herself. Elena Dawson took a seat at the desk, her posture straight, her fingers poised above the keyboard. Every word she typed was precise, intentional, carrying the same quiet authority that had carried her through the entire ordeal. "I am available to meet," she wrote. "However, I expect this meeting to be more than a polite apology. I intend to discuss how your airline will not only address my experience, but confront the systemic issues that allowed it to happen in the first place. This is about accountability. I won't settle for anything less." She read the message one final time, then clicked send. It was done. The tone had been set. Now the airline would have to rise to meet it or fail in the spotlight of its own failure. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes briefly, letting the weight of the moment settle. The message was more than a personal demand. It was a declaration. They would have to take responsibility, not just for what Morgan Tate had done, but for the culture that made it possible. She stood and walked over to the window. The city beyond was bathed in the warm light of a fading day. The skyline shimmered in gold, calm and still. But inside her, Elena felt the storm building. She knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one she welcomed. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about how people were treated, how dignity could be so easily disregarded based on how someone looked, respect, fairness, humanity. As the sun slipped beneath the horizon, Elena allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. She had done what needed to be done. The groundwork was in place. Now she would wait and see how they responded. The next morning arrived quietly with the city of Westport beginning to stir beneath her window. Even before the streets filled with movement, Elena was already up, as she always was before important meetings. She hadn't slept much, but she didn't need to. Purpose had a way of making a sleep secondary. She moved with efficiency, preparing herself as if she were stepping into a boardroom, not a battle. She ran her fingers through her hair, checked the time, and took a deep breath. The weight of what she was about to do pressed against her chest, but not with fear. It was responsibility. No one else should have to endure what she had, being judged, dismissed, made to feel invisible. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She picked it up and smiled softly. "I'll be with you soon. You've got this." Daniel. His messages were always simple, always steady, but they never failed to bring her calm. He had walked beside her through years of challenges, and today was no different. By the time the call came in, Elena was ready. She answered without hesitation, her tone smooth and unwavering. "Elena Dawson, thank you for calling. Let's begin." The voice on the other end was female, clipped, but polite. "Ms. Dawson, this is Samantha Greer, senior representative with the airline's executive team. First, thank you for your patience. We've reviewed your case and would like to meet in person. It's important to us that we resolve this in a manner that reflects our values as a company." Elena listened, her face unreadable, her gaze steady. "I'm available today," she replied. "But let's be clear. This is not just about one apology. It's about your company's treatment of passengers and the staff. This was not a one-off mistake. This is systemic, and it has to be addressed at its root." There was a pause on the line. Samantha's voice, when it returned, was slightly less confident. "We completely understand, Ms. Dawson. We've already begun reviewing our internal," but Elena was already a step ahead. "We're already in the process of reviewing our internal procedures," Samantha Greer continued over the phone, "and we'll have a full plan prepared for you when we meet. We truly value all of our passengers, Ms. Dawson, and we're committed to ensuring nothing like this ever happens again." Elena's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. She'd heard enough promises in her life to know the difference between intention and action. Words were easy. Change wasn't. She had to spend years building a career grounded in integrity, and she wasn't about to let vague assurances pass for accountability now. "If that's the case," she replied evenly, "then I'll be ready." With that, she ended the call. She stood and walked toward the balcony, her mind already racing ahead. Part of her felt a flicker of satisfaction. They were starting to understand, but another part of her knew this wasn't the time to ease up. Talk meant nothing without follow-through. Real change required commitment, employee training, new hiring standards, proactive measures to challenge unconscious bias. This wasn't just about Morgan Tate's behavior, It was about a system that allowed it to happen in the first place. And Elena Dawson had no intention of letting that go unchecked. She stepped back inside the suite, the fire inside her steady and clear. This was her path now, and there was no backing down. She would walk it until the airline didn't just apologize, but proved it had the courage to evolve. A few moments later, Daniel joined her, his quiet presence grounding her once again. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "They'll listen, Elena," he said softly, "and if they don't, we'll make sure the world does." She turned to him, a faint but resolute smile forming. "This isn't about getting them to listen," she replied. "It's about making sure they remember, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel like they didn't belong." They left the hotel soon after, headed toward the airline's headquarters. Elena felt a rare calm settle over her, not because the fight was finished, but because the battle lines were finally drawn. She had done her part. Now it was time to see if they would do theirs. The corporate office stood tall, sleek, and modern, a testament to the company's curated image of professionalism. But no amount of glass and steel could disguise the tension that waited inside. She and Daniel entered the building and were promptly greeted by a receptionist who led them through the quiet corridors to a waiting conference room. Inside, the air felt dense. At the long polished table sat Samantha Greer, along with two other senior executives. Their smiles were polite, but their posture betrayed their discomfort. Elena could see it in their eyes. This was not a meeting they were looking forward to. Good. She took her seat with Daniel beside her. Her back was straight, her presence steady. She had walked into rooms like this before, rooms where perception shaped power. And today, she wasn't here to ask for respect. She was here to demand it. "Thank you for meeting with me," she began, her voice firm but even. "I trust you've reviewed the incident involving your employee, Morgan Tate." They nodded. Tension clung to the room like a static. "I'm not here to resolve a one-time mistake," Elena continued. "I'm here because what happened to me is part of a much larger issue. Your company has a problem, and it's one you can't solve with surface-level solutions." Samantha gave a tight nod. "We completely agree, Ms. Dawson," she said. "We've already begun reviewing procedures and are working to implement expanded sensitivity and bias training across departments." But Elena didn't respond right away. She was watching, listening, and deciding what came next. Elena Dawson let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then, with calm precision, she spoke. "I appreciate the acknowledgement," she said, her gaze unwavering, "but this isn't just about employee training." She scanned the room, her voice clear and firm. "This is about transforming the foundation of how your airline operates. You can roll out all the training modules you want, but if the internal culture doesn't change, nothing else will. This isn't just about correcting one person's behavior. It's about building a system that doesn't let bias thrive unnoticed." The executives shifted in their seats. She could see it, the discomfort creeping in, the reality beginning to settle. They had underestimated her, but she wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering, but gaining even more weight. "This can't just be a lesson for your flight attendants. It needs to be one for your leadership too. If you're truly serious about making this right, then you must accept full responsibility, not just for Morgan Tate's behavior, but for the broader culture that allowed it." She paused deliberately. This isn't just about me being humiliated on a flight. It's about the pattern, the unspoken rules and assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't, based on race, on class, on appearance. One of the executives, a silver-haired man in his late 50s, cleared his throat and leaned forward, his tone measured but defensive. "Ms. Dawson," he began, "we understand that bias exists in every organization. We're working to address it, but you must understand, we manage a large operation. Implementing a structural change takes time. We can't fix everything overnight." Elena's expression didn't change. "I understand that change takes time," she said quietly. "But that's no excuse for delay. Every day that goes by, someone like me, someone who doesn't fit the image your staff has of who belongs in first class, is being mistreated." She leaned in further now, her tone sharpened just enough to make it sting. "If you let this slide, if you treat it like a simple error, you'll set a precedent. And that's dangerous. I didn't come here to make this easier for you. I came here to make sure you understand there are consequences when people like me are treated as invisible." She let the weight of her words hang in the air. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Elena could see it happening. They were beginning to grasp that she wasn't just another passenger filing a complaint. She was a turning point. Her voice dropped a notch, more controlled now, but even more powerful. "You might think you can patch this over with a training seminar, an email to staff, or a half-hearted policy revision. But let me be clear, that's not enough." She straightened her spine, eyes locked with Samantha Greer, who was trying to maintain her composure but looked shaken beneath the surface. "I will make sure this doesn't get buried. This incident will be documented, shared, and your company, your brand, will become the example of what happens when bias goes unchecked at the top." Samantha drew in a breath and sat up straighter, her voice more deliberate this time. "We hear you, Ms. Dawson," she said. "Truly. And we're committed to real change. We'll do whatever it takes to ensure something like this never happens again." Elena gave a slow nod, but her eyes remained sharp. "I want specifics," she said, "not promises. I want a clear plan with measurable steps, deadlines, and accountability from the top down. I want to see exactly how you intend to dismantle the bias that let this happen." The room grew still. The air, once heavy with polite tension, was now thick with realization. They hadn't just offended a customer, they had ignited a movement. With deliberate calm, Elena rose from her chair. She didn't rush. "I'll be waiting for your plan," she said quietly, "and I'll be watching." Her final glance around the room left no doubt. This wasn't over, not even close. As Elena Dawson turned toward Daniel, who had remained quietly steadfast throughout the meeting, she offered him a small, knowing smile. There was no need for words. He had been with her every step of the way, and he understood what that moment meant. The battle wasn't over, but the first move had been made. The message had been delivered, and the airline had heard it, loud and clear. As they stepped out of the conference room, the door shut behind them with a soft click. But the weight of everything that had just unfolded lingered, pressing gently against the air around them. The corridor of the airline's headquarters buzzed with the quiet rhythm of a corporate machine in motion, phones ringing, feet shuffling, voices behind glass doors. But Elena barely heard it. She and Daniel walked in silence, wrapped in their own world of thought and focus. Her mind was razor sharp, replaying every exchange, every word from that room. She had made her position clear. Now it was on them to respond, not with promises, but with proof. As they neared the elevator, Elena spoke, her voice low but firm. "We'll see if they follow through." Daniel nodded, his expression steady. "They will," he said. "You made sure they know they don't have a choice." A slight smile touched Elena's lips. She appreciated his confidence. He had always believed in her ability to make change happen, but she also knew better than to assume the work was done. She had seen too many companies make bold declarations only to retreat once the attention faded. She wasn't about to let that happen here. In the elevator, she checked her phone. A few missed messages had come through, friends and colleagues checking in after hearing what happened. She scanned through them quickly, but one message stood out. "Heard what happened? Whatever comes next, just know you're making waves." She smiled softly at the words. Support like that mattered. But this was never about attention or recognition. It was about shifting the ground beneath people who had become too comfortable looking away. When the elevator doors opened to the bright sunlight of the Westport afternoon, Elena stepped out, letting the warmth hit her face. For a brief moment, everything felt still, like she had done exactly what she needed to. But she knew the next step wasn't far behind. As they neared the car, she spoke again, her tone certain. "We're not done yet," she said. "Now we wait, and if they don't follow through, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." Daniel didn't reply right away. He simply opened the car door for her, letting her slide in before joining her on the other side. The engine hummed to life, the car pulling away from the curb with quiet grace. Elena exhaled a slow, grounding breath. She was used to high-stakes rooms, corporate negotiations, political meetings, but this was different. This wasn't just about her name, her work, or her business. It was about a deeper fight, one for dignity, one for justice, one that ensured no one else would have to endure the kind of quiet humiliation she had. In the days that followed, Elena remained focused. The meeting at headquarters had been a beginning, not a resolution. She spent hours dissecting the details of what happened, speaking with advocacy experts and consultants who specialized in equity and inclusion across industries. She was building something bigger now, a movement that couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, Daniel handled the behind-the-scenes pressure. With his network in the business world, he knew exactly which levers to pull, where to apply pressure, who to reach, and the results were already taking shape. Soon, Elena's phone rang again. The name on this screen, Samantha Greer. The airline wasn't done talking. This time, Elena wasn't accepting half measures. She was going to hold them to every word. Elena Dawson wasn't going to accept vague promises. She had made it clear in their first meeting. Real accountability required real action, and anything less would be met with a louder, more public response than the airline could afford. As the next meeting approached, her resolve only hardened. She knew what was at stake. She knew the ripple effects this could have, not just on the company, but on the industry as a whole. When the day came, Elena stepped into the same glass-walled conference room she had entered a week prior, but the atmosphere was noticeably different this time. The executives were more alert, more careful, and Samantha Greer, who had once hidden behind professional poise, now looked visibly tense. Her body language betrayed the pressure the company was under. They knew what Elena represented now. This wasn't just another meeting. It was a reckoning. I hope some real progress has been made, Elena said, as she sat down, her tone measured but unyielding. I've been waiting for specifics. It's time to prove this isn't just a corporate performance to save face. Samantha cleared her throat, clearly taken aback by the directness. We've thoroughly reviewed the incident, Ms. Dawson, she said, and I assure you we're taking it seriously. We've already begun implementing new sensitivity training, revising customer service protocols, and reevaluating hiring processes to better identify potential biases. Elena listened, nodding once, but her expression remained unchanged. This sounds a lot like what I heard last time, she said calmly. Tell me, what measures are in place to hold your leadership accountable? Because if the change doesn't start at the top, none of this will matter. The room fell into uneasy silence. The executives exchanged glances, the discomfort thickening. But Elena didn't back down. If your company fails to take real steps, if you continue to allow bias to operate unchecked, I'll make sure the public knows what's happening. I'll make sure this doesn't stay behind closed doors. Samantha's face paled, her mouth opening slightly before she gave a slow nod. We'll do everything in our power to make it right. We're committed to meaningful change. Elena stood slowly, every movement deliberate. I'll be watching to see if that commitment holds, she said. But remember, talk is cheap. Action is what matters. If I don't see results, I'll be the one holding you accountable. With that, she walked out of the room, her confidence unshaken. She wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The following days were a blur of preparation and anticipation. But Elena didn't wait passively. She was gathering feedback, reaching out to experts, and quietly watching the company's next steps. She knew all too well that words were easy, that corporations often made promises hoping time would soften consequences. But not this time. She had no intention of letting them off the hook. She was still reviewing notes one morning when her phone buzzed. A call from an unfamiliar number. She answered, alert and ready. Ms. Dawson, a smooth voice said, "This is Graham Whitaker, CEO of the airline. I wanted to personally thank you for your patience and for holding us accountable. We've taken your concerns seriously. I'd like to request a final meeting to discuss the steps we've taken and what we're prepared to do moving forward." A quiet, controlled smile touched Elena's lips. The CEO himself, that was progress, but she wasn't about to be lulled by pleasant words. "I'm listening," she said, her voice sharp with expectation. And now it was his turn to prove the sincerity behind every word. "We've already launched company-wide bias training programs," Graham Whitaker explained over the phone, his tone professional but edged with the urgency of someone who understood what was at stake. "We've begun a full audit of our customer service policies, and we're reviewing our hiring standards to better identify and properly train any staff exhibiting unconscious bias." He paused, then added, "We're committed to shifting the culture, not just appearances." Elena Dawson listened, quiet but calculating. She appreciated the words, but she was no stranger to lip service dressed as reform. "I'm glad to hear you're moving forward," she replied, "but I need to see specifics, Mr. Whitaker. This cannot be a reaction to public scrutiny. I'm not just concerned with the conduct of your flight attendants. I want to know what you're doing to change your corporate culture at every level." There was a moment of hesitation on Graham's end, the weight of her words clearly sinking in. "You have my word, Ms. Dawson," he said slowly. "This isn't just cosmetic. We're taking this from the top down." We understand the gravity of this moment, and we're fully committed to long-term change. I'd like to meet again in person to walk you through the timeline of what's already in motion and what's still ahead. She could hear sincerity in his voice, but sincerity wasn't enough. I'll meet with you, Elena said, her tone firm, but let me be clear. If I don't see that commitment reflected in real actions, not words, I will make sure the public knows what really happened here. Your company will be held accountable. After a brief and formal exchange, she ended the call. Her focus shifted immediately. The CEO reaching out directly was a step forward, but she had been down this road too many times to celebrate early. This upcoming meeting would reveal everything. The airline would either prove they were serious about transformation, or they'd expose themselves as just another corporation scrambling to protect its image. The day of the meeting arrived. Elena, accompanied by Daniel, returned to the airline's headquarters. Both were composed, polished, and resolute. She wore her calm like armor. The tension beneath the surface, however, simmered quietly. She had heard their promises. Now it was time to test their substance. Inside the meeting room, Graham Whitaker was already seated, alongside Samantha Greer and two other high-level executives. They stood to greet her and Daniel, their expressions polite but visibly strained. They knew what this meeting represented. Elena nodded as she sat down. I hope you've come with more than just reassurances, she said smoothly. Today is about proof. Graham nodded, gesturing to the screen as the presentation began. We've taken several steps already, he said. We've brought in a nationally recognized diversity and inclusion consultancy. They've begun training, not only for our frontline employees, but also for senior leadership. Slides flicked across the screen detailing action items. The program focuses on identifying and addressing unconscious bias, improving cross-departmental communication, and fostering a more inclusive culture across all operational levels. Elena remained still, arms folded across her chest. Her face betrayed no emotion. And how do you plan to measure the impact of these programs? She asked. Words on paper mean little without proof of progress. Graham didn't flinch. He was ready for this. We're launching post-training feedback forms for all participants, and we're implementing performance assessments every 6 months to monitor behavioral improvements. The data will inform continued policy refinement. The words were solid, but Elena wasn't swayed easily. She needed more than intentions. She needed transformation. We're also revising our hiring policies, Graham Whitaker continued, to ensure we're bringing in a more diverse pool of candidates and that every employee, regardless of background, is treated equitably. Elena Dawson didn't respond right away. She let the words hang in the air, her mind dissecting every point. So far, they were saying the right things, but she wasn't ready to hand out praise just yet. Then her voice cut through the silence, sharp, clear. What about accountability? She asked. What's being done about employees like the one who moved me from my seat without cause? The room stilled. Graham's face grew serious. We've enacted a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, he said. All staff are now required to complete mandatory training, but beyond that, we've established strict disciplinary measures. If an employee violates our values, they'll face real consequences. He leaned forward slightly. We've also launched a new passenger reporting system, one that routes complaints directly to an internal oversight team. Every report will be tracked, investigated, and followed up on swiftly. Elena gave a slight nod, processing. This was new. It was structural, but she still wasn't ready to let her guard down. "I'll be watching," she said quietly, "because words mean nothing if they're not backed by action." Graham met her gaze, a steady, "We understand, and we're committed to proving that we mean what we say. This isn't a one-time fix. It's a long-term change." The meeting ended with that promise. Elena left the room with the same calm, composed demeanor she had walked in with. She had done what she came to do: force them to name the problem and take the first real steps toward solving it. But she also knew the real test wouldn't come in a boardroom. It would come later, in how the airline treated every passenger, every day, long after the headlines faded. In the weeks that followed, Elena stayed vigilant. She didn't disappear. She monitored their updates. She took every call, read every email. Graham and the executive team kept in touch, sharing their initiatives and expanding on their implementation timelines. The company had rolled out the promised training. They had refined hiring practices. They had created new systems for reporting discrimination. But Elena knew better than to be impressed by appearances. The real measure would be in how they responded to the next incident. And she wasn't about to let them coast on good intentions. She tapped into her network: friends, colleagues, contacts in the industry. Several had flown with the airline in recent weeks. The feedback, mixed. Some passengers described kinder, more attentive service. Others noted subtle shifts, flight attendants being more mindful, more respectful. But not everyone had a positive experience. Some said things still felt performative. Elena wasn't surprised. Real change took time, but she wasn't going to ease the pressure just because the direction looked promising. One afternoon, as she sat at her desk scanning the latest internal policy update, her phone rang. Samantha Greer's name flashed across the screen. Elena answered, calm as ever. "Ms. Dawson," Samantha began, her tone cautious but hopeful, "I wanted to personally update you. Since implementing the new programs, we've seen a marked improvement in workplace culture. There's still work to do," she admitted, "but we're seeing better engagement from both staff and passengers. People are noticing the difference, and we're not stopping here." Elena listened. She didn't offer quick praise, not yet. But something inside her stirred. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to understand. A permanent shift. That's what Samantha Greer had called it. Elena Dawson leaned back in her chair, processing the executive's words carefully. "I appreciate the update, Samantha," she replied, her tone measured. "But the real question is, how will you measure success in the long run? How do you make sure this doesn't just become another corporate checkbox?" There was a pause on the other end before Samantha spoke again, her voice cautiously optimistic. "We've put together a dedicated oversight team to track progress and measure impact. We're also developing a system that rewards staff who actively foster inclusive environments. And we've made it easier for passengers to report issues in real time without barriers." Elena nodded, though she wasn't yet satisfied. "I'll be watching," she said. "I don't want press releases. I want proof, tangible results." The call ended, leaving her with a familiar mix of hope and skepticism. She had pushed for real change, and maybe, just maybe, she had sparked it. But she knew better than to declare victory too soon. The real test wouldn't come in meetings or policy memos. It would come in the everyday moments, months, or years from now, time passed, and to Elena's cautious surprise, signs of progress began to surface. She stayed in contact with people across the industry, especially frequent travelers. Feedback from passengers suggested the changes were taking root, slowly but steadily. Flight crews were more aware, more engaged, less quick to judge. But Elena knew the real test was coming, and when it did, it came fast. One morning, she opened her inbox and found a message from a woman named Jasmine Rivera. Jasmine had recently flown with the airline. Like Elena, she'd held a valid first-class ticket. And just like Elena, she had been asked to move because a flight attendant assumed she didn't belong. The moment she was seated, she was questioned, dismissed, moved. The same story, just a different name. But Jasmine wasn't staying silent. She had already shared her experience on social media, and it had exploded. Thousands of people were rallying behind her. Elena read the email slowly, every word echoing her own frustration from months before. But this time, it was different. The airline had promised change. Now they would be forced to prove it. Without hesitation, Elena picked up her phone and called Samantha Greer. "I've just received another complaint," she said, her voice low but firm. "Her name is Jasmine Rivera. First-class ticket, moved because of how she looked. This needs to be addressed, and fast." There was a sharp silence on the other end of the line before Samantha responded. "I'm so sorry to hear that, Ms. Dawson. I'll look into it immediately. Thank you for bringing it to our attention." Elena ended the call and sat back, her thoughts racing. This was the moment of truth. This incident would reveal whether the airline's promises were real or if they had only changed on paper. Later that afternoon, her phone rang again. Graham Whitaker. "Ms. Dawson," the CEO said. His voice weighted with concern. "We've reviewed the incident involving Ms. Rivera, and I want to personally apologize. This should never have happened. We're conducting a full investigation, and I'll be overseeing the resolution myself." Elena let the words settle before replying. "This is the test, Graham," she said quietly. "This is where your values are either proven or exposed. I need to see that this isn't just handled, but transformed. I need to see that Jasmine and I were the last." There was a pause, then the same sincerity that had marked their earlier talks returned. "You have my word, Ms. Dawson. We will get this right. We're committed to handling this swiftly," Graham Whitaker had promised, "and will implement a stronger safeguards to ensure this never happens again. You'll see the changes with your own eyes." Elena Dawson ended the call with a quiet sense of resolve. This had never just been about one flight attendant. It was a test for the entire company. Now, it was about whether the airline had the courage to live up to everything it had promised. Over the following weeks, changes unfolded rapidly. The airline launched a full internal investigation into Jasmine Rivera's complaint. Staff were interviewed. The flight log was reviewed. And within days, the airline issued a formal apology to Jasmine, both privately and publicly. They didn't stop there. New measures were rolled out immediately: updated service protocols, real-time complaint tracking, and visible commitments to transparency. For the first time, Elena allowed herself a cautious breath of relief. She watched closely from the sidelines, not to catch them failing, but to ensure they were finally learning. She didn't ease up because she knew the real danger wasn't in a blatant discrimination, it was in complacency. As the months passed, the airline's transformation became more visible. Passengers reported improved experiences. The crew, once tense and reactionary, now moved with empathy and care. Training wasn't just something they endured, it was something they talked about. And then, one quiet afternoon, Elena came across an article. Airline sets industry standard for inclusion and accountability. The piece outlined the airline's journey, detailing the sweeping changes, the revamped hiring processes, and the internal culture shift. It even named Elena Dawson as the catalyst for it all. She stared at the headline for a long moment, then smiled softly. She hadn't done it for credit. The change was her reward. She picked up the phone and dialed Daniel. "They're finally listening," she said when he answered. But this is just the beginning. A year passed. The woman who once sat quietly in seat 2A, dismissed for how she looked, had become a voice far bigger than anyone could have imagined. The airline wasn't perfect. No company was. But they had changed. Their culture had shifted. Their staff was more diverse. And they were now being studied as a model of how to confront internal bias with accountability, not a spin. Elena, for her part, hadn't slowed down. She had taken her story beyond the airline, speaking at conferences, consulting with industries, mentoring young professionals of color who faced their own battles with being underestimated. She had become an advocate, a leader, a movement. And though her name was beginning to show up on magazine covers and industry panels, she stayed grounded in her mission. One crisp morning, her phone rang. Graham Whitaker. "Ms. Dawson," he said, his voice sincere, "I just wanted to thank you, personally. What you've done, it's had a lasting impact on this company, on all of us. I'm proud of the progress we've made." Elena closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the journey settle in. "Thank you, Graham," she replied, "but this was never about me. It's about the people who will benefit from these changes. Long after we're gone, long after I'm gone." The words echoed in Elena Dawson's mind as she ended the call and set her phone down on the desk. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the skyline outside the window. The city buzzed below her, alive with movement and possibility. And yet, in this quiet moment, she allowed herself something rare: stillness. She had made a difference. From a single humiliating moment aboard a plane, she had sparked a conversation that became a catalyst for change. One passenger, one voice, one truth. She had forced an entire corporation to look in the mirror. She had demanded justice, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been misjudged because of the way they looked, the way they dressed, or where they came from. Elena had shown them that dignity wasn't something to be earned. It was something every human being deserved. She had challenged a culture built on assumptions, and she had won. Not with outrage, but with resolve, with a strategy, with truth. From that first seat, she was asked to leave. She had reshaped an entire industry's path. But even now, Elena knew the work wasn't finished. Bias didn't disappear overnight. Judgment still lurked in subtle glances, in closed doors, in unspoken rules. The fight for equality, respect, and humanity was never a one-time battle. It was a lifelong mission, and she was ready for whatever came next. Her gaze lingered on the horizon, the sky turning gold with the late afternoon sun. A soft smile touched her lips, not of triumph, but of purpose.